Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, we're going to discuss pearl cotton thread as opposed to embroidery floss. Now, pearl cotton can be found in many embroidery shops and some craft stores that sell embroidery floss. But other than that, it's a little more difficult, a little more of a specialty to find. Like embroidery floss, it's used for, well, embroidery and other projects similar to that, like tatting and crochet. Embroidery floss has 6 strands in each skein. Those strands are wound together to create one thick strand, but you can easily take them apart to use one or all 6 strands, or combine any number of colors together to get an interesting effect. Now, pearl cotton is a 2-ply twisted thread, but you're not supposed to take it apart. You use each thread as it comes off the skein or the ball, depending on the size. Unlike embroidery floss, pearl thread comes in sizes: a 3, a 5, an 8, or a 12. And the size 3, the smallest number, is the thickest thread. So it's used for different things than the 12. The idea is when you have the ball of cotton pearl, which comes in sizes 8 and 12, or the skein, which comes in 3 and 5, you use it straight off the skein or the ball. There are a few little tips and tricks to getting it off the skein because the skein isn't wound together the way embroidery floss is, and I'll show you that in a moment. But before we get to that point, I want to just talk a little bit about pearl cotton thread. The reason it's called pearl cotton is from the French name. When you use the pearl cotton thread, because it's twisted, that 2-ply I told you about, it looks like it's beaded. The stitches look like beads, and that's the French word, perle. It can be spelled pearl, P-E-R-L-E, or P-E-A-R-L, depending on the manufacturer, but they're one and the same purpose anyway. Now, there are additional differences between the pearl cotton and the embroidery floss. Pearl cotton thread is put through a process that makes it very strong. So it's really great to be used for things like attaching buttons or cordage. There's lots of things you can do with pearl thread. Now, you can do them with embroidery floss, but you can get a little stronger effect with the pearl cotton. The bottom line for me is, for the most part, they're interchangeable. So if I find a particular color of thread or embroidery floss, I don't hesitate to purchase one or the other. But if I know I need something really strong and thick, I'll probably go with a larger pearl thread, the 3 or the 5, to use it to get that effect. Can I get that effect with embroidery floss? Yeah, with enough strands of embroidery floss, I can. Now, there is some intentional usage for pearl cotton thread over embroidery floss. Ultimately, it comes down to preference and how strong you need your thread to be. But it's used for making cordage, for tatting, for crochet, for punch needle, and even for quilting, because it's so strong that these purposes are really useful for the pearl cotton thread. It also tends not to bleed in the wash. So if you have something functional, you might lean towards using the pearl cotton as opposed to the embroidery floss, which may bleed in the water and the detergent. So with a skein of embroidery floss, which is kind of what we're comparing the pearl floss to, or the pearl thread, it comes with 2 labels. If you go to the bottom label, you can fool around and get one strand that isn't tucked in or attached. There's another strand as well, but you want to take that one from the bottom, over the barcode, and you can pull it out and get your thread without knotting up. If you take it from the other end, it tends to knot up. And then if you want to separate it, you just hold the end, tap the top, and you can see all the strands. And it's just one continuous piece of thread that's wound back and forth. It's not the case with the skeins. So here we have the same situation in that we have 2 labels, but I'm gonna just slide off this bottom label here to show you, as well as the top label. And now it doesn't go back and forth. As you can see, it's twisted and wound. So what I do is I look for the bottom label, the one with the barcode, and I usually find something where there's some strands either knotted or an indication of the end of the thread, and it's usually with a knot. You can see here that I found it fairly easily. Now, you could fuss around and untie that knot. I just tend to clip it. Just makes it a little bit easier. And here I have the start of my thread. What you want to do is just gently unwind it. And now it's a continuous piece. It's very long. And from here you can either keep it just like this, or you can take a piece of thread, the length that you're going to use, say 12 to 18 inches, or whatever size you like, and thread your needle. And I would just get rid of this little knotted end. Now, if I want to store my thread and I want it to be neatly wound just like it was when it came in, I would just bring my threads down and up, making sure they're nice and neat. I take one end and then the other, and I'm just going to twist it in the direction that it was twisted originally. Then I fold it in half and I twist around that loop. And that's how I can preserve it, if I like that way. I'm not really too concerned about that. It's very hard to get these pieces back on, but I do like to know what size thread it is. So I'll pick a little piece of tape and put the 5 there, or I'll rewind this in a way that I can use, keeping that label together. If I'm concerned about the color or the barcode, I'll save this piece as well. Now, the first method involves taking apart the skein. It's not my preferred method unless I know I want long lengths of the pearl thread, or unless I know I'm not sure how I'm going to use it in the future and I want to preserve those long lengths. The reason I hesitate to use this, or I take a breath and decide if I really want to use it this way, is because it's very hard to get back into the original shape. At least for me. It takes a little bit of work. Lately I haven't had the patience. Now, the second method is so much easier. However, it results in already clipped lengths of thread, which are about 19 inches, 18 to 19 inches. This is the method that I prefer to use, and I tend to work in 18 to 19 inch lengths anyway. So let me show you this quick way of clipping your cotton pearl so that you can use it. So one way to keep your thread intact, if you don't want to take it all apart like I showed, is to just slide the labels to the center. And this keeps the skein together. And then you'll see that there's one side that's looped, just a single loop, and the other side has 2 ends. That's from when they twist it. So what you'll want to do is cut your threads, and this creates completed length threads all cut for you ahead of time, but it keeps them together. So I find that area with a little knotted loop and I snip that off. And then I take each of the ends here, so the side with 2 ends, I come and I find the actual loop. Just takes a moment to make sure I have all my threads on the right sides. And I can snip them here. And I do the same to the other side. Now, by doing this, I think I have about a 19-inch piece of thread, and I'll go back to the loop and I'll just choose one thread and I can gently pull it out. Take one thread, pull out one side, and then I have it contained on the skein. And now I have a 19-inch piece of floss that I can use. Now they're all sliced to that 19-inch length. So you have to keep that in mind. You might not want that. You might want longer pieces. But for me, this works pretty well. And it's a way to keep my skein nicely organized. So that's a second method. So now with a ball of thread, it's just one continuous piece. All you gotta do is hunt around for the end piece and cut what you need. It's very simple. I find that these are a little easier to find in the different sizes, the balls, as opposed to the skeins, but it really depends on what store you're at and where you're looking for your floss or your pearl thread. Another thing you can do with your ball of thread, if you can't find the end, is just reach in here and pop out your little label. Set it aside to save it, and then usually you can unravel the end from there. And then when you're done, you can just put that label back in place, pop it into place, and you have all your information together just as you need it. So now let's take a look at the thread and how the sizes compare with one another. So here's a little sampler that I made just to give me some information about the pearl thread, and I hope you find it useful too. I did the 4 numbers, 3 through 12. You can see the largest stitch as well as the smallest stitch, 12. And I did just little cross stitches, stem stitch, up and down, and French knots. So you can get a really interesting view of how thick the 3 is versus that 12. It's just very helpful. I also stitched some of the variegated thread just to see how that would look. It was a number 5. I didn't find it in all of the numbers. It's probably out there. I just did a quick search, but I wanted just to get an idea of the texture and the thickness. And so that's how that looked. I'm really pleased with it. To give me a little more information on this sampler, I created another sampler using just the floss. So here I use 6 strands of floss, and it's a little thinner than the number 3. Close, very close, but not exact. 5 strands over here produces something very similar to the number 5, but it's a little thicker. It's not quite right in terms of exact. The 3 strands is somewhere between the 5 and the 8. The 2 strands, somewhere between the 8 and the 12. And the 1 strand is just a little more delicate than the 12. So you can achieve similar results, just not exact. And I'll hold it up really close so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I find the pearl thread most useful when I don't want to separate strands of thread. I just like being able to pull it off of the ball or the skein and use it. Could you go your entire life doing embroidery without using pearl thread? Yes, but I really enjoy all the different colors and textures, and the batches are quite different. So if I see pearl thread that I like, I'll pick it up and use it in my work. So ultimately, there are a few differences and a lot of similarities between cotton pearl thread and embroidery floss. And ultimately, it's up to you which you prefer. It's nice to know the intentions of the cotton pearl versus the embroidery floss and some suggested ways they're useful. Ultimately, the thicker the thread, maybe lean towards the cotton pearl. But if you don't mind combining thread, well, then you can use embroidery floss. So it's really up to you. I hope you found this video helpful. And if you did, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And thank you for joining me today.